All right, everybody, welcome back. This is the second video in a three-part series dealing with wargaming, statistics, and probability. In this video, we are going to go over how I assemble statistics and probabilities for Conquest units, focused on one unit in particular, the 100 Kingdoms crossbowman. And we're going to look at how those numbers come about, and we're actually going to look and see how those compare with other units and briefly talk about linear regression. Now, getting into this, I will say statistics is not something that a lot of people enjoy in college. It's a dry subject. It's going to be a lot of math, and I'm going to be briefly touching over it. So bear with that. With that in mind, understand what we're about to get into is not the most exciting of subjects. All right, so section 2, turning tangibles into probabilities. And going back again on what tangibles are actual physical, concrete, mathematical statistics that produce a deterministic outcome. Some things to understand. This is my method. It is not the method. So why do I say that? There are dozens of ways to come up to the conclusions that I come up with, and you'll hear people talk about their way. That's great. There's a bunch of ways you can get to the end here. This is just my way. So maybe this will show you something that you didn't know, or maybe you have something that I don't know, and you could reply back in a comment about something we could consider. One thing about this method of mine is that I'm always refining it. I'm always changing it, because as I add things to my algorithms, I get a better result. So today, this video is basically what I have as of right now. And it is based off of an algorithm that I have used for over 20 years in my own game design, as well as coming up with point costs and whatnot for other games. We're going to take the unit down to its component statistical probabilities. I am going to use R and Excel to get my values. I'm not going to really see a lot of that in this demonstration, but R is a language that is used by statisticians to visualize data, and Microsoft Excel, of course, is a spreadsheet. So you've heard the term spreadsheeting. Well, Excel is one of the ways that we can spreadsheet. All right, main objectives. What are we looking to get out of this? Well, there's a few scores I'm looking for. Number one, I'm looking for an output score. That output score is what I use to weigh a unit's overall baseline math. So it's overall how powerful is it from a baseline perspective. That is a combination of 3 scores. It's offense, which is how much damage it can do. It's defense, which is how much damage it can take. And I also use movement as a secondary score. It's how far it can move, because a unit that can move 5 inches is at a disadvantage to a unit that can move 15 inches and who can also fly, right? So those all come together to create an output score. The second score I'm looking at is the efficiency score. And the efficiency score is how many points I have to spend to get a point of output out. And you're going to see this in the slides a couple times, but what I will say for about this is just because a unit has a high output score doesn't necessarily mean it's a good choice to take, because if a unit has a high output score but you're paying 800 points for that unit, you know, that may be too many points to pay, and you'll end up being at an overall disadvantage because you're putting too many points into the unit. Okay, so those are the 2 scores I'm after. Now, normalization. Normalization is a term. What we're trying to do is we've got a number of scores, and we have to bring all of those numbers and make them all in the same scale or the same league, so to speak. So that's the whole point of normalization. So for example, in this case, you're going to see offensive scores are going to be lower than defensive scores raw by the probabilities of what I'm looking at, and I have to make those 2 values relate to each other. So we normalize them. We apply some math to bring them up so that the 2 numbers that we're looking at are apples to apples instead of the other way around, apples to oranges, or whatever you want to use. Tangible outputs, or excuse me, tangible inputs. So tangible inputs are all of the things we consider for a unit. So in this case, we have the crossbowman. And we know that the crosswoman does the things you see on the screen. Those are all the hard mathematical bits. And behind my little video, there's also a little square that says terrifying. Because terrifying lowers the unit's resolve, which means you can actually get more people to run away in melee. So I also consider terrifying. So this is an array of all of the different values that I use currently to determine a unit's output score. And there's quite a bit of things. So I actually input these into an Excel spreadsheet. And once we get these guys down out of the Excel spreadsheet, we can import them into a program such as R and analyze. And in this case, we're going to take those outputs and turn it into the unit's overall output and its efficiency score. All right, so calculating offensive scores. Well, starting off with the output, the input, offense is the damage that the unit can do. And we know that there are two different basic types of damage that a unit can inflict at its base. And there's other special rules like Aura of Death, etc., that can contribute to casualties here as well. So we have range attacks and we have clash attacks. So what I want to do is I want to get the probability of all of the range attacks with and without aim, with and without obscuration against defense 1 through 6, also taking deadly shot into consideration, and that's going to give me an average score. So for the crossbowmen, when I do all those values, like 24 values, I get an average score of 2.187. So against all of the defensive capabilities out there, the crossbowmen are averaging 2.187. Obviously, if I'm firing at defense 1, I'm going to do a lot more damage than if I'm firing at defense 5. But this just kind of averages those together. Clash is taking the melee against defense 1 through 6, and is also looking at inspire and not inspire, and we're adding impact hits, deadly blades, as well as resolve failures. So in this case, the crossbowmen do 2.999 average damage in melee across all of the defensive scores in the game. So they do a little bit more clash than they do ranged, but that's because of resolve. And we add that together, and we get a raw offensive score of 5.187. So the crossbowmen have that for their raw score. Now under the hood, this is where we get into some of the math. And we have the range score. When you calculate what you're looking at here is if we have a volley of 2, range versus defense 1, I have a 33% chance of hitting, and out of 12 attacks means I'm going to get 4 hits. So we know I'm going to get 4 hits, and with AP 1 against defense 1, we know they're not going to get any saves at all. So that's 4 hits. And then we do range versus defense 1 obscured. Well, that's half, so that's 2 hits. Range versus defense 1 with aim. Well, that's 6 hits. And then range versus defense 1 obscured, we get 3 hits. And this kind of breaks down the math. So aim, of course, adds 1 to volley. So volley 3 is 50% of my hits. And I take all of those values, and I get an average, and that's where the 2.187 came from. So here we have all of those scores being dumped into the average bucket for range attacks. We do the same with clash, only this time we're going to add resolve. And because we're adding resolve, the clash in this case does a little bit more, and we add those two numbers together, and again that's where 5.187 comes from. So I take 5.187 and I put that somewhere, and this is actually where I use R, and R calculates all this for me. I write a bunch of code and it stores all these pieces of information in like an internal spreadsheet. Okay, then we have defense. So how I do the defensive score is I need to know how many hits on average it takes to take this unit down against cleave 0 all the way to cleave 4. And yeah, I could have gone higher, but in this case, I think cleave 4 is the highest that I can see without buffs. So again, it's being applied across all of the game. So if it's being applied across all of the game, everyone's following these same standards. So I want to know, based off of my defensive scores, which is my defense score, evasion score, resolve score, bastion, shields, how can I hold up against offensive attacks coming at me? So with the defensive 1, we know the unit's going to save 1 out of 6 hits against a cleave 0 attack. So here's the math. That means against cleave 0, I should take 14, basically 14 hits. And how we know that is because I take 12 wounds of a 3-stand model, and I multiply them by 100% plus 16.7%. 16.7% is 1 out of 6, and I get the value 14.004. So the remainder of this comes out as that. When I average all of my sets against cleave 0 through cleave 4, because against cleave 1, well, cleave 1 removes my defensive 1, so I know that I can take 12 hits because I only have 12 wounds. That gives me a 12 across the board. So basically, cleave 1 through 4, I'm going to have 12 hits, and then cleave 0, I have 14 hits. That all averages out to be 12.4. Okay, that's my first defensive score, because that is just against hits without taking resolve into account. Because, and I do this because volley attacks don't induce resolve. So I need to take those into account plus attacks that do resolve into account. And what I do is I'm going to average those together. So 12.4 without resolve. So if I add resolve into the mix, you can see the number that comes out here is 8.4. It's a lot less. They have a resolve of 2, so they're going to fail 2 and 3 resolve rolls. So against cleave 0, we know it takes 14 hits to remove the unit. We know that 67% are going to fail their resolve rolls. So I don't actually have to do 14 hits if I'm using any other attack other than volley. In this case, on average, I only need 10 hits because 4 extras are going to run away from failed resolve rolls. So I take 67% of the number of hits, and I get 10.004. And again, I do that for all of the cleave. And I come up with an average of 8.4. So this is an 8.4 defensive score with resolve, and I had 12.4 as a defensive score without resolve. And I take those together, and I get an average of 10.4. So that gives crossbowmen a defensive score of 10.4. All right, cool. So we go back to normalization. I'm trying to get these two numbers, offensive score, defensive score, and I want them to be comparable to each other. So to make them comparable to each other, I have to normalize them. So how I normalize them, if we look at the slide here, we see we have 5.187 is offense, and we have 8.911, or excuse me, 5.187 turns into 8.911 based off of a comparison between 5.187 and 10.4. You take all of the scores, all of the offensive scores, and I'm only doing this in this example with one unit. You don't ever, examining one unit is useless because these numbers mean nothing. Its use comes from when you have all of the units together. So I get an average, and what I do is I get the average offense versus the average defense, and I know about, at that point, what the scale is. So I divide the largest by the smallest, and in this case, as the slide says, I get what I call a normalization vector of 1.718. And that basically means that the scale is off 1.718. So if I multiply all of the offensive scores by 1.718, those numbers are now comparable. So 5.187 has 1.718 multiplied against it, and it becomes 8.911. So crossbowmen have an adjusted normalized offense of 8.911 versus their defensive score of 10.4. All right, so I have 8.911 offense, 10.4 defense, and then I'm going to add their movement score. Now the movement score I do not normalize because I want it to be a secondary score. I do not weight movement the same as offense and defense because movement has a lot more intangibles applied to it. Because just because a unit can move 50 inches doesn't mean that the player is going to be able to use that appropriately. Whereas clash score, it doesn't matter what your skill is. If I've got 10 attacks and I have a clash value of 2, I know that I'm going to hit 1 in 3 of those attacks, always. So that's why I leave that as a secondary score. So I do things such as, if you have fluid formation, I will add movement and a half to your score. And if you can fly, I will double it. In this case, crossbowmen don't do any of those things, and they just have movement of 5. So I take the 3 values and I add them together, and the total value, which is hidden by my fat head, is 24.311. So I have 24.311 as the overall final score for the crossbowmen. Now, again, stressing, the values by themselves mean nothing. We have to have all of the units, and in this case I've done all of the currently released models, not the whole game, to kind of see where everything sits for me. And what this is going to do is give me a good idea of their baseline. And the baseline is in all caps there to show you that this is just their tangible values. If we go back to the first video, I explained that the baseline is the tangibles, and the intangibles, which is player skill and all of the abstract abilities like healing and all the other things that can't have a mathematical value applied to them, make up the overall use, which will differ from game to game. The baseline value will never differ from game to game because the statistics are never going to change. Some additional notes. I also do some math to determine the value of when I add stands to a unit, both wide ways because they're going to get all their attacks in clash and volley, and depth wise because they're only going to do support. And I do that because I'm actually creating an army builder that will add all of these scores together, so when I add units to a regiment, it can calculate the appropriate value. In terms of my comparisons in this video, it's just basically the min-size units. So the full picture starts to come when you can add all of the pieces together and say, well, what if I want the men-at-arms unit to be 6 instead of 3 stands? Because I know they're going to tank better, they're going to have more wounds, and they're going to have a higher resolve. So all that is actually calculated in my spreadsheet, and I can add those. And when we actually see the next video, when I analyze the battle report, Spires versus 100 Kingdoms, the second one, you're going to see that being used when I create the overall power. And this is just an example of the values of the crossbowmen. When you break down each item, I'm looking at full clash, full volley, and then I'm also looking at what happens if they're just supporting. Because if you're just supporting, obviously the offense gets smaller. And what you're going to find is as you add stands, depth-wise, you're adding to the defensive score largely, but the offensive score is very small. Additionally, I've also added characters into the mix. Now, character, you pay a lot of points for a character, and I don't do the characters with the regiments because their numbers throw everything off. So like a 105 point unit of crossbowmen, and what I don't know the points off the top of my head, but like an 80 point officer, those two values are totally different scales because the officer does a bunch of abstract things. But if I were to add the officer's 80 points in for what he does, it would drag down all the averages because he doesn't do as much in terms of fighting and whatnot tangibly. So I do the characters separately, and they have their own little values. And what I do is I add those values to a unit when I want to gauge. If I add an officer to a man-at-arms unit, for example, what does that give me? If I add an officer to the crossbowman unit and with Bastion, what does that give me? And it will actually show me overall output score increase because if they have Bastion, their defense goes up by 1. I also multiply the offensive output by 3 so that I can gauge a Noble Lord or a High Clone Executor and compare it to a unit because you're paying about the same points for one character as you are for 3 stands of a regiment. So I want to know the comparison between the two. And I don't think that's necessary. You could also not multiply it by 3, but that's just the group I chose to go. I also do not do this to monsters because monsters aren't heroes, so to speak. They are like regiments. So now we have, that gives us our output score. And now we have efficiency. And I talked about this a little bit earlier. A unit with a high output is great on paper. A unit with a high output but high point cost may be a trap unit. And what we mean by saying trap unit is it looks really good on paper, but when you field it, you're going to be disappointed a lot because you're paying too many points. It may not be, but it's something to look for. A unit with a low output but a high points cost will likely never be used. And in several games, which we won't go into, those are common. All right, so in this case, if we're going to get efficiency, efficiency is real easy. You get the points cost, you get the output score, you divide 105 in this case divided by 24.311. You divide the points by the score, and we find out that crossbowmen spend 4.319 points to get a point of output. So that's their raw efficiency score. By itself, that is a useless number. It only becomes useful when we have all of the units and we can compare that number against all of the units. So in this case, this first pass, all of the lower numbers are better than the higher numbers, because if the number is higher, that means I have to spend more points to get a point of output, and I don't want that. I want it to be as low as possible. I can also break this down by offense, defense, and overall, which I do because I like to look at those different categories. I like to look at what's efficient offensively versus defensively. Now, once I have these numbers, it's kind of weird because, normalization, we talked about that. I need to get the numbers to basically relate to each other. Well, same thing here. With output scores, we want high output scores. So I want the efficiency scores to also be high is good and low is bad. Right now, low is good, but high is bad. So I've got to flip those. So to flip them, I find the maximum efficiency score. That's the worst one. And I add 1 to it. And the reason I'm going to add 1 to it is because I don't want any scores to be 0. I want them to be a minimum of 1, because 0 is, to me, a useless number. It means you're totally useless. You have totally no efficiency, which is not true, in my opinion. I want the min to be 1. And anyhow, I flip those around. So to flip them around, I give you my algorithm here. It's simply saying the efficiency score of X, where X is the subtype, meaning offense, defense, or overall. The efficiency score of X is equal to that max score that I just calculated minus their current score. And what that will do is that basically flips them around. So example, if a max score was 12, so some units got a 12, and the crossbow come out to be 4, then the crossbow's new efficiency score is an 8, so higher is better. If the unit that scored 12 comes out as a 1, so to get them to come out as a 1, it's simply the max score of 12 minus their score of 11, because remember I added 1, it'll be a 1. So that's going to give me a list of all of their efficiencies. Now, I'm also going to normalize those scores. I want to make sure all those numbers are roughly the same as my output score. So at this point, I have efficiency scores, which are they're going to be smaller, and I have my output scores, which are going to be bigger, and I want those scores to be comparable. So I normalize them again. So it's the second normalization I do. And in this case, normalization, I call it a normalization vector, is the average of the output score. So that total output, I get the average score, and I divide it by the average efficiency of X, where X is either the efficiency of their offense, the efficiency of their defense, or the overall efficiency. And at that point, I have that number, and I multiply the efficiencies by that number. And in this case, you can see the crossbowmen come out to have an offense efficiency of 37.47, defense of 40.42, and overall 37.96. And you may say, wow, those numbers are a lot larger than the numbers I just saw for output score. And that's true. That's because I'm taking into consideration all of the units, and we've got units that have an output score of 50. So my range is 1 to 50. So these efficiency scores actually fit right in with that. You just don't see that because we're just focused on crossbowmen. So we put it all together and we model the data. So as of now, I have in my spreadsheet 39 different combinations of currently released units. It's not everything. I could get a lot more in depth. These are the things that I see a lot. It's all of the regiments baseline, and then I have things like some with deadly shot, some with an officer or a character that I see a lot. I want to know their overall score. So this is to give you an example. Crossbowmen out of 39 ranked 27 in terms of their total output. So their normalized score actually doesn't even show up on this screen. You can see the first time we see crossbowmen at the very bottom is number 27, and that's when you include the officer that has Bastion. So number 1, the very tippy top, we have the clone infiltrators with deadly shot, and then the clone infiltrators. Those are right now the most powerful unit output-wise released in the game. And then we go down the list. So if you look at some of these, you've probably heard a lot about these being used. The Berserkers, you hear about those a lot. You hear a lot about Steel Legion. You hear a lot about the Abomination. Household Knights might surprise some people because Household Knights are kind of panned for not being shot cavalry, but that's not their job. Household Knights can actually do a decent amount of damage on the charge, and additionally, they're pretty good tanks. They have really high defense, so they're up there as a high output unit. But just because the unit has a high output score doesn't mean it's a good unit to take. So for example, Steel Legion with a Drill Master and Bastion Officer has a pretty good output score. But as you're going to find out, well, you're not going to find out because it's not going to be on the list, but it's actually lower in the efficiency rating. It's not exactly something that instills a lot of efficiency. Steel Legion with the Drill Master giving Fury, same thing. You're going to get a lot more output, but is it worth the points you're paying? And again, that falls down in the efficiency list. So that becomes a personal choice, and you can use this data to look at that and go, I don't necessarily know that I want to use that. Bearing in mind, your overall list output score is nothing more than you buying your list like normal and then adding all these output scores together to get a final value. That's your final overall army's score. So efficiency doesn't matter at that point. You've bought what you bought. So here's your efficiency scores from top to bottom. We can see that crossbowmen actually come in at number 9. So crossbowmen for 100 Kingdoms are a fairly efficient unit for what they do, for the points you pay. Topping the list right now, we have militia bowmen. They cost really low amount of points. They don't really do a lot of damage, but for what they can do in tank, they are great efficiency-wise. We see that the Vanguard clone infiltrators, oh look at that. Not only do they have super high output, they're also really efficient. Force-grown drones, real cheap for what they do. They don't have a huge amount of output, but they don't cost very much either. And now think about the intangibles, which is Ferromancer healing those and adding more to that unit as you try to kill them. This is a very efficient unit, and I wouldn't be surprised to see a lot of these as screens out in the real tables, especially once more things get released. I still think force-grown drones are a good choice. Flame Berserkers, high output, also high efficiency. Not surprised. You've seen a lot of games with the Flame Berserkers, and they're kind of like an automatic take because their only downside is they can't hold objectives, but they can rush across the table and pretty much punch anything in the face. Abomination, he's out there is highly efficient and had high output. So did you happen to notice, and we just talked about this, the units that were both high in output and high in efficiency, and I just gave a list. We call those units highly optimal. So when competitive players are tuning their lists, which we talked about in the last video, they're looking for efficient choices. They're looking for things like this. They're looking for high output units baseline that are also highly efficient baseline. And why is that important? Because again, the baseline score doesn't change. It's just basic math. The intangibles are the player skill adjustable pieces. If I start the game with a high baseline, then I can afford to make some mistakes. Whereas if you have a lower baseline army, you have to play better than I do. So if I'm tuning my list, I want my list to carry as much weight as possible. That's how people do it, right? That's one way, or at least one way they do it. I used to use a thing called linear regression. And linear regression lets us know it's basically a diagonal line. So it's a diagonal line, and it says if I pay 0 points, I should have 0 output, and if I pay 10 points, I should have this much output, and if I pay 20 points, I should have this much output. And in a perfectly balanced game with 100% baseline tangibles, it would follow a diagonal line, just a straight diagonal line. In a war game, there's a lot of intangibles, and you're never going to really see that. What I would expect in a balanced game is for that linear regression line to have the values really close to around that line. And I've done this on probably a dozen games, and right now Conquest is not perfect, and we're going to see a picture in here in a minute, but it's also not that bad, especially compared to certain other games where the deviation off of this line is gross. And I'm not going to get into that in particular, but it's gross. So it makes me feel good about Conquest balance as it is. All right, and last slide. So we made it. This was created in our studio, and so I took all my data, and this is that diagonal line. So if we're following the diagonal line, if you look down, what that means is I would expect this output score down here versus my points cost on the left. That means the farther right you go, the more powerful you are. I should pay the same type of points in a linear progression. So if I am tuning my list, what am I looking for? Well, if you look at this slide, you're looking for units that fall under that line, or units that are on the line, or maybe slightly above that line, this also shows you the ones that are really bad. The ones that are way above the line are choices that paying too many points for the outputs that I can give them. Now, is this an absolute? No. We've said this before, and I'm going to say it again. This is not an absolute. This is a guideline that people use when tuning their lists. You can absolutely take non-optimal units and do well with them. In fact, for many years, that was one of my goals, was I tried to create B lists that could do well. It's a lot more challenging, but you can do it. So if we look, you see force-grown drones down here in the lower left here, way down there. That's very optimal. You got Dwegam Hold Warriors, they're very optimal. You got Militia, very optimal. Here are those Bowmen, very optimal, especially for what they're able to do. You got Flame Berserkers, which are towards the middle here. Let's see, Steel Legion with a Drill Master actually comes out to be about on that line. So, and I know I personally use Steel Legion with a Drill Master. Some people pan it as not being optimal. According to this linear regression, it's not horrible. It's not the best in efficiency, obviously, for 100 Kingdoms. We have Household Knights, which are better efficiency right here. Straight up Steel Legion, that's significantly lower than that line. That's more efficient than the Steel Legion with the Drill Master, but I don't think that's a bad choice at all. It's sitting near that line. It's about what I should pay. And then over on the right, you have the Vanguard Clone Infiltrators. Those guys are what I would consider the current outlier in terms of balance. If there's something not balanced, I think it's them. They do a lot of damage, both in clash and volley, and they don't pay enough points for that. They're light, so people say, well, they're light, so they can't hold objectives, so that balances that out. I don't have an opinion on that right now. Either way, it could balance it out. I'm not sure, because I think how these are going to be used is to come out and basically punch big holes in the opposing army, and that is hugely valuable. Even if they can't hold objectives, just the amount of havoc they can wreak is that's worth a lot, right? So anyhow, that's it. That is how I create these numbers. I do share those with the community. I'm actually working on a web portal so that we can view these visually, which I think will be neat. I need to do a little bit of work with that, though, before I can make that human consumable. I am happy to share my spreadsheets. In fact, I am going to upload a file. It will be a comma separated file, or a CSV file, and you can upload that into Excel. And it's basically the Excel spreadsheet of all these values, the final values, if you want to look at them. You can also use any type of spreadsheet program that can read CSV files. So I'm not going to make it an Excel format, because I know not everyone uses that. All right, so we made it to the end. Boring statistics, 30 minutes later. Next video, we're going to discuss the battle report, and I am going to apply video 1 and 2 to that tactical analysis. So if you've watched video 1 and 2, a lot of video 3 will make a lot more sense than if you're just blindly sat down and I'm starting to talk about all these output scores and you have no idea what I'm talking about. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you maybe picked up some things. If you have any tweaks or your own way of coming up with information, please share it with the community. That would be awesome. Until next time, though, thank you, and I will see you soon.